I was given a fun little task where my user wants to insert a number of weeks and then convert that into how many years and months would that project take, assuming they actually follow the plan. I want to have one field where the user simply inputs the weeks, and then eventually it should spit out one line. And to simplify the process, I'm going to split it into the intermediate calculations and then summarize them in an output. And after, I'll show how you can create a function both in Excel 365 and in VBA, because unfortunately you need Excel 365 to create your own function inside the workbook. The first task is to convert the week input into the number of whole years. And I'm going to assume that there are always 52 weeks in a year, which isn't exactly correct. It's a fine enough approximation. This gives me a decimal number, and I have at least two options to fix it. I could either use the round down function to make sure it always rounds down, or I could use the integer function, because that actually does the exact same thing. That's the whole number of years. I can then get how many weeks do I have remaining by taking the week input and minusing it with the number of whole years multiplied by 52. I then need to convert the number of remaining weeks into the number of whole months, where I can use the same process. I'm going to assume that a month is exactly 4 weeks, which isn't accurate, but I can live with it. And here I don't want to round down, because if I have 2.5 months, I want to round that up to 3, meaning that the number of years and months it will take to complete the project is actually in what time period will the project be completed, assuming it follows the allocated time. So I don't want to use integer divide to say 10 divided by 4 and then round it down. I want to do the opposite. I want to round up. And conveniently, there is a function, but it's a deprecated function, I think it's called. So my number is the remaining weeks divided by 4. And again, that is not exactly accurate, because that would be 28 days, and that can be up to 31 days in a month. And then I say significance 1. So I round up to 3. And then all I have to do is combine the calculations into 1. I'm going to be cheeky and copy it, which gives me the text. The project is estimated to take space, and you need to remember the space here, otherwise there is no space. That's the number of years, and then years with plural, and then months. And if you wanted to be fancy, you could account for if the amount of years is equal to 1, then I wanted to say 1 year, and if it's not equal to 1, I wanted to say years, plural, and the same with months. But I think that would be cumbersome in an Excel solution. If you have access to Excel 365, then you can use two functions to create a function inside Excel that you call, just like you can call max. Those are called the Lambda and Let functions. The Let function lets you create variables, because notice how I've actually created 3 variables up here. Instead of doing the actual calculations inside this cell, I'm simply calling these intermediary cells, which is functionally the same as a variable. I've simply split it up into more manageable parts. Can't show you how to do the function, but I can copy paste it. It follows the same logic. You say lambda, and then the week input is then the value that you give. Like with the max function, you need to provide a number. You would write in the name of the function, parentheses, and then reference the cell that contains the week number, or simply write it yourself, and then the calculation will happen. Let is saying that I want to have a variable called whole years, which does the same calculation as I did up here, except I used the Danish word for int, so I need to change that. The week input is referencing the argument I input in my Lambda function, which means that this let is inside the Lambda function, which means I have access to the argument I provide when I call the function and actually use it in the sheet. That can be a bit intimidating when you create the function, because it's hard to figure out where am I right now. Also, I need to remind you that if you use American Excel or another country, then you don't use semicolons, you might have to use commas instead. But even though I have Excel in English and my functions are in English, I still need the semicolon because I'm Danish. So variable 1 whole years does the same calculation I did in this row. The remaining weeks again does the exact same as I did in this row, and whole months also does the same here. But I also need to change Auron Loft into ceiling. This row is then the exact same as I did up here, except instead of referencing a cell, I'm referencing a variable name, because again, let gives me variables that I can then call. So this row is the output of my let function. That's why I have the parentheses down here, and I have indentation to make it easier to read. So the lambda function lets me create a function that takes one argument, and this whole block is then the calculation done, which uses my input argument, and then it outputs something. Once you made a lambda function, and again, unfortunately, I can't show it, but if you want to test it after this final parentheses, you would need to put in an open parentheses, and then what value do you want to test the function with. In my case, I'd use 62 and then say enter. then the output of this function would then be the project is estimated to take 1 year and 3 months. When you then want to convert this code into an actual function, you need to go into the name manager, which you can get to by holding down Control and F3, and I can probably find where it is. Under formulas, and then under define name, you can say define name. Actually, I need to go into name manager instead, Control F3, and then you would input here. The name would be what do you want the function to be called, so it could be convert weeks to years, months, and this is then the text you need to write after your equal sign, and then here in refer to you need to copy paste that function. So again, that wouldn't really work because I don't have Excel 365, but this is how you do it. And then you get access to the function, so you could write convert blah 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 62, enter, and then get that as an output. The weakness with Lambda functions is that they are located physically inside the workbook, meaning you can't use it in another workbook. And that's a big weakness because you might get used to using this function in your workbook 1 and you want to take it into another workbook. But if you don't know that the function lives inside name manager, you might not know how to copy it over to your other file. I would generally avoid Lambda functions for the same reason I'd avoid VBA functions, because you need to make sure you copy them over. But the strong benefit of Lambda, you don't have to make it a macro-enabled workbook. I also need to remember to say that you could also in this Lambda function handle what do you want to happen if the amount of years, the whole years is equal to 1, then you don't want to type that parentheses s parentheses. And if the number of years is different from 1, then you want to have the plural s. And the same with months. But again, I think it would make it hard to read because then you have actually 4 conditions. Is years equal to 1 or not equal to 1? And is months equal to 1 or not equal to 1? And I don't want something that complicated for such a banal calculation. And in this video, I also want to show how to do the VBA solution. So you'd go under Visual Basic, open that up. And with functions, you can't type them inside of the sheet or inside this workbook. You do have to create a new module. You can see in my helper file, I also have the module down here. In order to create my function, I simply have to write the word function and then the name that I want to give the function. Convert weeks to years and months, and then VBA, because in my tester file I had Excel 365, so I called the function that I use with Lambda, I called it that, and then I need to differentiate it with VBA. And here's a function that takes an argument. Next, I just want to say enter, because then I get the end function. It takes an argument, which is then what do you want to convert? That is, what is the number of weeks you want to convert? And I want to call that week input inside of my code, so I know what that refers to. And here I want to help the developer understand what my code does. It takes the week input argument, and that needs to be an integer, so a whole number, because it doesn't make sense that you say, oh, it will take 50.7 weeks. That doesn't make sense. Then round it up to 51, because that's the number of weeks it will take. And then I want it to return a string because I wanted to write the text. The project is estimated to take this much time. And here I can help the developer even more and say that I want it to be an integer because you can have more than 255 weeks. And if I set it as byte, then it would crash. So 255 weeks, that means it can be more than 5 years. Which, if you know Ben Flubia, you would probably laugh at you if you think you can be accurate up to more than 5 years. But some people think they can predict the future.
I'm gonna keep that in even though it's dumb to say.
I need a bunch of variables. Whole years is bytes. I don't think it will be more than 255. Weeks can't be more than 52. And months can't be more than 12. My output string is what I want to create to store my string. Lastly, I want 2 variables that will store whether I have 1 year or 1 month, or I don't have 1 year or 1 month. That will make it easier to do my if statement. Here I can either choose the data type to be Boolean, which means true or false, or I could use byte, so it could be 1 or 0. And byte takes fewer bytes. To no one's surprise, the byte type takes 1 byte, and I think Boolean takes 4. But I think it makes more sense actually to use Boolean because that's the point of Boolean, that it can only be true or false. So it's just something that makes it easier to understand this function if you have to read it in the future. The calculation for whole years is still the same. I want to do an integer division of my week input, which comes from the argument when my user uses the function. And this needs to be divided by 52. And remaining weeks is still the week input minus my whole years multiplied by 52. In order to do rounding up, I can't do something like ceiling. That function doesn't exist within VBA. I can do it in a roundabout way by using application.worksheet function. And now I have access to the worksheet function, so the ones you write in the base Excel. And that function is then the roundup that we're used to. Again, I'm going to assume that 1 month is exactly 4 weeks, which isn't true, but it's accurate enough. I can personally live with that. And here I could also add the note that I want to round up, because I think it's more accurate to say that if it takes 3 months, even though you finish earlier, that is the amount of time it would take until you're done. So you might finish in the 10th of March, but that means you finish within the month of March. So that's simply my decision that I think it makes more sense. Since I already have my whole years and whole months variables, I can already fill out the 1 year yes and 1 month yes variables. So if whole years is identical to 1, then I want 1 year yes to be equal to true. Here, the benefit of the Boolean date type is that VBA already tries to autocomplete, which is another benefit over using byte and saying 1 instead of 0. But ultimately, it's up to you. I've moved over to using Boolean instead of byte, which means I already have all of the calculations I need to do. I simply need to construct the actual string. And I know that my output string will always start with the project is estimated to take some amount of time. And I'm going to cheat and copy that from my note. So I know it will always start out with the project is estimated to take, and then remember the space, otherwise you get a no space, and then an ampersand, whole years, and a space, and then year. And I can then decide whether I need to add the plural s in the next line to say that if 1 year yes is equal to false, then, and actually I might as well do that in one line, no point in doing it in multiple lines, then the output string should be equal to itself plus an s. And actually, it's not if it's more than 1 year, it's if it's different from 1, because you would also say it takes 0 years, plural, even though 0 is not plural, but I guess that's how grammar works. And then I can add the second portion of output string, which again is that it should equal itself, its current value, and then I also want to add space and space, whole months, and likewise space month. Once again, I need to check if 1 month, yes, is equal to false. Lastly, I need to add a full stop, and it seems a bit silly to have an entire line of code dedicated to adding a full stop, but that's kind of what I need to do. I could do an if statement with two conditions. So if 1 month yes is equal to false, I add an s with a full stop. Otherwise, just add a stop. I think this is way easier to read because you do have a simple condition. So I'd rather do it like this. Because I have a function, I need to say what should the function return. So what should this function be equal to? And it should be equal to my output string, which means that I can just write 62 and then I can say convert weeks to years and month VBA. And like with a normal function, you can't get this tooltip or helper. And then when you try to use the function, you also get more help saying, well, what are the variables called? You don't get anything. So you need to know what the function takes as an argument, and that's a big weakness because there's no help for this. So 1 year and 3 months, and it has plural for months, and then you can test it out by saying, what if it takes 3 weeks? Well, then it takes 1 month because 3 weeks gets rounded up. And likewise, 53 weeks would be rounded up. If you have 600 weeks, it would take 11 years and 7 months. And I'm sure you can come up with some projects that ended up taking that long, which really should have been divided into smaller projects. But I'm not a project manager. I just think it's silly to make a project that takes 11 years. You probably shouldn't do that. That's very optimistic. So, yep,